list off a few of the terrifying and awe-inspiring figures from history, and no doubt you'll come across Attila the Hun, who ruled over the vast Hunnic Empire covering Central and Eastern Europe from 434 to 453 AD. Renowned for his extraordinary military skill, he led multiple campaigns against the Eastern and Western Roman empires, causing such a catastrophic loss that he gained the nickname the Scourge of God. The geopolitical landscape of late antiquity was altered by the Huns' tremendous pressure on the established civilizations, which was made possible by Attila's ability to unite disparate tribes under a single, disciplined force. In addition to his military skill, he was also quite a good diplomat, who negotiated tributes and treaties that preserved the stability and power of his growing empire. And so, as a testament to this unwavering strength and determination, Attila's legacy lives on. It shows the difficulties of leadership and the influence of nomadic empires on the development of European history. And we're going to learn all about it today, from start to finish, as we talk about the life of Attila the Hun. But first, where are my manners? We can't begin without welcoming you to the channel again, can't we? I do it in every video, you know. So here I am again, saying welcome to the newcomers and welcome back to those who are watching again. If you've been watching from the start, well, leave me a comment. Actually, tell me how long you've been on the train for, and we can all discuss in the comments for the juicy engagement. Well, with all that said, let us begin. Of course, we have to begin in a little bit of a blurry spot. Now, this is pretty normal for nomadic peoples not keeping records and only really getting talked about from the sources that come from Roman and Greek records, those quote-unquote civilized peoples that they came up against writing about them once they got in contact with them, and doing so from quite a biased point of view. So with that in mind, the only real comprehensive sources are written in Greek and Latin, and by the enemies of the Huns. And this is why putting together a historiography about him faces, well, more than a few obstacles. Only shards of the numerous testimonials that Attila's contemporaries left behind about his life survive to our modern day. Now, we do know that as a member of Theodosius II's embassy at the Hunnic court in 449, one Priscus, a Byzantine historian, that being the Eastern Roman Empire, you know, Constantinople, this sort of thing, and a diplomat who wrote in Greek, was both a witness to and an actor in Attila's story. In fact, he's the only person known to have written a physical description of Attila, not a very kind one at that. And his writing is a significant source of information about Attila's life. But despite all that, he's still an Eastern Roman, and you can clearly see the political bias. He wrote 8 books, spanning the years 430 to 496, in which he chronicled the history of the late Roman Empire. And of course, with Attila ruling from 434 to 453, well, this is smack bang in the middle of where we need to be to say that he is indeed a primary source. Now, there are only pieces of Priscus's work left, unfortunately, in addition to being a significant source of information about the Hunnic Empire and its neighbors. Was frequently cited by historians Procopius and Jordanes in the 6th century, particularly in the work of Jordanes, The Origin and Deeds of the Goths. which is filled with references to Priscus's history. 100 years, actually, after Attila's passing, he recounts the Hunnic peoples and Attila's legacy in general. And we'll get to Jordanes a little bit later. It's quite a good description that he provides us of the death of Attila. Between the 6th and 17th centuries, many ecclesiastical writings contain valuable but dispersed information that has occasionally been distorted by years of hand copying, or is just in general difficult to verify. The 12th century Hungarian writers suppressed some historical details and added their own legends in an effort to present the Huns as their glorious ancestors. Of course, this isn't just the case with Attila. This happens for many historical figures, many historical events. You might find a trend in all the history books that when it comes to the wars, the good guys win every time. What a coincidence. Well, with that in mind, of course, whenever you look over these sources for Attila, I hope you've brought your many grains of salt with you, because you are going to have to take many of them. So the Huns themselves, well, they passed down their literature and knowledge orally, from generation to generation through chanted poetry and epics, much in the same way that we'd see it with the Gauls, the Germanics, and pre-Roman Germanics, even going up to the Britannic tribes that were inhabiting Britain before they had writing and all the rest. One of the main reasons why we've lost all of the Druidic knowledge was because it was simply orally transmitted through stories and poetry, epics, this kind of thing. Well, literature of the Scandinavians and Germans, who were the Huns' neighbours, and wrote between in the 9th and 13th centuries, has indirectly given us these little snippets of the oral history. Attila plays a significant role in numerous Eddas, sagas, and medieval epics, and there is one that he's particularly prominent in, that is the Nibelungenlied, which you can look up. Now, archaeological research in more modern times has revealed some information about the Huns' way of life, their art, and of course, the warfare, what they're really known for. But I hate to disappoint to tell you that the actual location of Attila's capital and his tomb have not yet been discovered, although there are some indications of battles and sieges. Perhaps it's not so much of a disappointing thing to let you in on that, but perhaps it's more of an exciting thing that, well, it's still out there. Same as the burial place of Alexander the Great, by the way, which is reportedly, the last I heard, at the main crossroads of Alexandria. Of course, the main crossroads of Alexandria have certainly changed in the last 2,000 years. Perhaps it's going to be a little bit difficult to find that, and we're not going to be ripping up the entire city just yet, but I digress. Back to Attila. So let's start and try to trace back the Huns. Originating east of the Volga River, the Huns were a group of Eurasian nomads who moved further into Western Europe around 370 and managed to establish a vast empire. Now, what was their prime military skill? Really, they were famous for their javelin throwing and, of course, mounted archery, which they were masters of. Essentially, they would show up, kick heads in, and then just ride away. Now, this was a little bit different because everybody was supposing that they would have the normal pitched battles and, swords to swords, all this sort of thing. Well, the Huns didn't really do that. Unfortunately, they were not playing by the old rules. Well, although they were a pastoral warrior society that was still establishing settlements prior to their arrival in Western Europe, the main source of food they had were the meat and the milk from their herds. Really, they behaved somewhat in the same manner that the Mongols of later times had behaved. Pretty much the same sorts of techniques. But for centuries there has been disagreement over the Huns' language and place of origin. The Turkic language, possibly the closest to the contemporary Chorvash language, may have been spoken by their leaders, at the very least, according to some theories. Well, the Huns, especially those who migrated to the west, they may have been a combination of Central Asian Turkic, Mongolic, and Ugric peoples, and is at least according to the Encyclopedia of European Peoples. It's pretty reliable, though. It seems to make sense. So early in the 5th century, there was a Hunnic Empire jointly ruled by the kings Oktar and Ruga, whose brother was Attila's father, Mundzuk. Although the Huns frequently practiced this type of diarchy, historians are not sure if it was a regular occurrence, a custom, or perhaps an institutionalized system. Although he came from a noble family, it's unclear if they were part of a royal dynasty in general. And what about Attila's birth date? Well, guess what? No one really knows. But it's been put really around 395, or thereabouts. Give or take a few years. Some say it falls somewhere between the 1390s and the first 10 years of the 5th century. In fact, even as far as the year 406 has been suggested. Well, Attila was raised in this very quickly changing world. Of course, if you know anything about the time, you would know that the old order was well and truly collapsing. The Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self. And whatever happens to those fallen empires, when the new people start dipping their toes in, and a new order takes its place? Well, only recently had the nomadic people of the Huns reached Europe. They invaded the Gothic kingdom between the Danube and the Carpathian Mountains after crossing the Volga River in the 370s and annexing the territory of the Alans. And they were a highly mobile people. The Germanic tribes simply didn't seem to be able to hold up against the mounted archers. And by this time they had already well established a reputation for being unbeatable. In the west and in the south, as well as along the banks of the Rhine and the Danube rivers, large populations of Hun refugees migrated from Germania into the Roman Empire. After crossing the Danube in 376, the Goths first submitted to the Romans, before turning against Emperor Valens, whom they assailed in the Battle of Adrianople, 378. In order to flee the Huns, a large group of Vandals, Alans, Suebi, and Burgundians invaded Roman Gaul, that is modern-day France, at the end of December in 406, crossing the Rhine. Since 395, the Roman Empire had been divided into two parts. Many political and religious disputes. Well, with two separate governments in charge of the West, which was not based in Rome, actually, but based in Ravenna. At that time, Rome was not a place that you wanted to be. But in the East, the great city of Constantinople was the capital. Of course, this is bearing the namesake of its progenitor, Constantine, and in our modern vernacular it is called Istanbul, and it has been for about almost 600 years, but we don't want to talk about that. Despite a number of power struggles, the majority of the Roman emperors during Attila's reign, both east and west, were actually members of the Theodosian family. As for the Huns, they ruled over a sizable area with hazy borders that were set by the will of numerous ethnic groups. While many maintained their own identities and rulers while acknowledging the suzerainty of the Hun king, others were simply assimilated into the Hunnic nationality. Although many of the Romans' issues were indirectly caused by the Huns, who drove different Germanic tribes into Roman territory, the two empires had more or less friendly relations, because the Romans employed the Huns as mercenaries, you see, against the Germans, and even in their civil wars. Thus, in 424, Joannes the usurper was able to assemble an army of thousands of Huns to fight Valentinian III. This operation was overseen by Aetius, who would actually go on to become patrician of the West. Not a bad career progression, though the retirement plan's not very good. Their alliance, which lasted from 401 to 450, and allowed Romans many military triumphs, involved the exchange of ambassadors and hostages. The Romans would have preferred to see this as payment for services rendered, but the Huns saw it more as tribute. When Attila had reached adulthood during his uncle Ruga's rule, the Huns had grown to such a great power that Nestorius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, lamented the state of affairs, stating that they had become both masters and slaves of the Romans. Of course, the old patriarch seems to be a little bit worried about balances of power. But as you know, the pendulum always swings, doesn't it? After Rugila, also called Rua or Ruga, died in 434, the united Hun tribes were ruled by his brother Mundzuk's sons, that being Attila and Bleda. The Hun tribes were negotiating with the envoys of the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II at the time of the two brothers' ascension, in order to bring back a number of renegades who had sought asylum in the Eastern Roman Empire. These individuals might have been Hunnic nobles who disapproved of the brothers' takeover. Well, so seated in horseback in the Hunnic fashion, Attila and Bleda met with the imperial legation at Margus the following year and negotiated a favorable treaty. In exchange for opening their markets to Hunnish traders, returning the fugitives, and paying a ransom of 8 solidi for each Roman captured by the Huns, the Romans agreed to double their previous tribute of 350 Roman pounds, which is about 115 kilograms of gold, bringing it up to about 700 Roman pounds of gold. And that's a lot more gold than before, if you're not a mathematician. Well, of course they were satisfied with this agreement. After all, doubling the amount of gold is a pretty good result. So the Huns left the Roman Empire and went back to the great Hungarian plain, possibly in an effort to fortify and expand their empire. After all, they had the money to do that now. But Theodosius took advantage of this chance to fortify Constantinople's walls, constructing the city's first sea wall, and to bolster his Danube border defences. Ever wonder why they're called the Theodosian Walls? Well, I don't need to explain too much into that, don't I? So as the Romans invaded the Sassanid Empire over the following few years, that is, the kind of like the Persians, we can bubble it down to that, the Huns stayed pretty much out of sight. I wonder what they were doing. Well, after the Sassanids defeated them in Armenia, they simply gave up their invasion and returned their focus on Europe. And then they resurfaced in force on the Roman Empire's borders in 440, attacking the traders at the market established by the 435 treaty on the north bank of the Danube. They destroyed forts on the Danube and the cities of Illyricum, including, at least according to Priscus, the Moesian city of Viminacium. At Marcus, where they demanded the Romans surrender a bishop who had kept property that Attila considered his, they launched their advance. The bishop betrayed the city to the Huns by sneaking away while the Romans were debating his fate. Of course, he is remembered as a coward. Well, in come the Vandals. Sure you've heard of them, under Gaisaric's leadership, and they took control of the western Roman province of Africa, and its capital, which I'm also sure you've heard of, Carthage. This was all while the Huns were targeting city-states along the Danube. Not a very good time for the Eastern Roman Empire. Well, Rome relied heavily on food from Africa, of course, and it was the wealthiest province in the Western Empire. In fact, Egypt was known as Rome's bread basket, or grain basket, whatever you want to call it. And every single day, ships would go back and forth across the Mediterranean, taking Rome everything it needed to survive. Once that was threatened, you can certainly imagine how much panic could set in. Well, in 441, Armenia was also invaded by the Sassanid Shah, Yazdegerd II, as if things could not get any worse. So, to launch an expedition against the Vandals in Africa, the Romans depleted the Balkan region of its troops and sent them to Sicily. And this gave Attila and Bleda a direct route to the Balkans, which of course they invaded in 441 after passing through Illyricum. After looting Margus and Viminacium, the Hunnic army captured Sirmium and Singindunum, which is modern-day Belgrade, by the way, in Serbia. In order to finance operations against the Huns, Theodosius ordered a large issue of new coins during 442, recalling his old troops from Sicily. He rejected the demands of the Hunnish kings, because he simply thought that, well, why even hear the demands? I'll just show up and kick some heads in, and no problem. As a matter of fact, we're Romans. That's what we do. Well, he was about to learn a few grim realizations. In response to all this, Attila launched a campaign in 443. His troops successfully attacked the military bases of Ratiara and Nisus, modern-day Nish, and slaughtered the locals after acquiring rolling siege towers and battering rams for the first time ever. At least, that's what the Romans thought, that was the first time ever that they ever had them. Either way, new toys, always welcome. Priscus had remarked, "On our arrival in Nisus, we discovered the city completely abandoned, as if it had been looted. Only a few sick people were lying in the churches. We stopped in an open area, a short distance from the river, because the entire area next to the bank was covered in the bones of soldiers who had died in the battle." The Huns then advanced along the Nishava River and captured Arcadiopolis, which is modern-day Lulaburgats. They also captured Philippopolis, modern-day Plovdiv, and Serdica, modern-day Sofia. Outside of Constantinople, they came across and routed a Roman army, but the eastern capitals double walls prevented them from continuing. After all, siege equipment will only get you too far. A second army was also routed close to Callipolis. As for Theodosius, he conceded defeat after failing to mount a successful armed defense, and dispatched Magister Militum per Orientem Anatolius to negotiate terms of the peace. The terms were, of course, much more severe than the previous treaty. The annual tribute was tripled now to 2,100 Roman pounds, about 700 kilograms in gold, and the ransom for each Roman prisoner increased to 12 solidi. The emperor agreed to surrender 6,000 Roman pounds, about 2,000 kilograms of gold, as punishment for breaking the terms of the treaty during the invasion. The Hun kings retreated into the interior of their empire after their demands were temporarily satisfied. And at this point, Bleda, Attila's brother, passed away after the Huns had left Constantinople, most likely in 445. Of course, this means that Attila was the only Hun ruler after seizing the throne for himself. He rode south through Moesia once more in 447, entering the Eastern Roman Empire. There he fought the Battle of Utis with a Roman army led by the Gothic Magister Militum Arnegesiclus, lost, but not without suffering heavy casualties. So, without any resistance, the Huns swept across the Balkans to Thermopylae. The Isaurian forces of Magister Militum per Orientem Zeno saved Constantinople itself, and Prefect Constantinus stepped in to protect it by arranging for the walls that had previously been damaged by earthquakes to be rebuilt and, in some cases, to build a new line of fortification in front of the old. Of this time, Callinicus, in his Life of Sentipartius, wrote, "The barbarian nation of the Huns, which was in Thrace, became so great, more than 100 cities were captured, and Constantinople also came into danger, and most men fled from it. And there were so many murders and bloodlettings that the dead could not be numbered, for they took captive the churches and monasteries, and slew the monks and maidens in great numbers." In 450, Attila formed an alliance with Emperor Valentinian III and declared his intention to attack the Visigoth kingdom of Toulouse. In the past, he had enjoyed good relations with Flavius Aetius, a powerful general in the Western Roman Empire. Attila's troops against the Goths and Baguade had earned him largely the honorary title of Magister Militum in the West, and Aetius had been exiled among the Huns for a short time in 433. So Attila's plans might also have been impacted by Gaisaric's gifts and diplomatic efforts, as he opposed and feared the Visigoths. I think it's so fantastic that these Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns, they're all knocking about at the same time. Picked a bad time to be a Roman, that's for sure. But Honoria, that is, Valentinian's sister, had escaped her forced engagement to a Roman senator in the spring of 450 by sending the Hunnish king a request for assistance, along with her engagement ring. Seems pretty obvious what that means, right? Honoria may not have meant, however, for her message to be interpreted as a marriage proposal, but Attila certainly did. And you really can't blame him. He agreed, of course, and he requested a dowry. A pretty generous one, too. In fact, he wanted half of the Western Empire. Now, that's pretty cheeky. That is A pretty hefty demand. Well, only his mother, Galla's Placidia's influence, persuaded Valentinian to banish Honoria instead of murdering her after he learned of the scheme. Additionally, he wrote to Attila, vehemently disputing the validity of the purported marriage proposal, to declare that Honoria was innocent, that the proposal had been valid, and that he would eventually reclaim what was rightfully his. Attila dispatched an emissary to Ravenna to remember that that is where all of the politics is happening now, away from Rome at this time. Following the passing of a Frankish king, Attila meddled in a succession dispute. Aetius backed the younger son, while Attila backed the older. There is speculation, by the way, regarding the whereabouts and identities of all of these kings. Either way, after gathering his vassals, including the Visigoths, Rugians, Heruls, Thuringians, Burgundians, Gepids, and Alans, Attila started a westward march. He arrived in Belgica in 451, with an army that Jordanes had inflated to 500,000 soldiers. Of course, when you read some of these old Roman and Greek sources, remember how I told you about those pinches and grains of salt? Yes, another one of them. It always sounds more exciting when it's inflated like that. Well, either way, both Strasbourg and Metz were taken by Attila on April the 7th of that same year, 451. The hagiographic vitae created to honor, or created rather, to honor their bishops can be used to identify other cities that were attacked. In Reims, Nicasius was killed right in front of the altar of his church. Servatus is said to have used his prayers to save Tongeren, just as Saint Genevieve is said to have saved Paris. By personally meeting Attila, Lupus, the Bishop of Troyes, is also recognized for having saved his city. Of course, meeting with the enemy of God himself. Well, definitely must put on the armor of God for that one. So Aetius, in order to fight Attila, organized a force of Franks, Burgundians, and Celts. Theodoric I, the Visigoth king, was persuaded to form an alliance with the Romans by a mission by Avitus and Attila's ongoing westward advance. The Hunnish advance was checked and reversed when the combined armies arrived in Orleans before Attila, a location typically thought to be close to the Catalaunian, present-day Châlons-en-Champagne. Aetius pursued and captured the Huns. In order to use his cavalry, Attila chose to engage the Romans on plains. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, in which the two armies engaged, is generally regarded as a strategic triumph for the Visigothic-Roman alliance. Now, according to Edward Gibbon, the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is required reading, by the way, and also Edward Creasy, too, Aetius failed to press his advantage because he was as afraid of the repercussions of a decisive Visigothic victory as he was of defeat. And as for Theodoric, he was actually killed in the battle. From Aetius's perspective, the best result was really what happened. Attila was in retreat and disarray. Theodoric was dead, well and truly. And the Romans had the advantage of looking quite victorious. Of course, hold that up as a propaganda win. The glory days are back, boys. Rome is on top again. Well, not quite. I'm afraid one victory, one battle, does not mean the war is over. Attila invaded and devastated Italy on his way back. A little bit of revenge, slamming the door behind him in 452 to reaffirm his claim to Honoria's hand in marriage, which he certainly had not forgotten about. These attacks caused the inhabitants to flee to small islands in the Venetian lagoon, where communities were established in what would eventually become Venice. That's right. Oh, and there will be a full history of Venice coming up soon. There's someone in the comments who keeps asking for it. So, well, I better do my damn job and do one for him then. That's if I haven't already published it. Anyway. His army destroyed Aquileia so thoroughly that it was later difficult to identify its original location after he pillaged many cities. So now, with only a shadow of a force, Aetius was able to harass and impede Attila's advance, despite lacking the strength to engage in combat. We're talking guerrilla tactics, this kind of thing. Small skirmishes on the baggage train. Well, at last, Attila stopped at the river Po. By this time, starvation and illness seemed to have spread throughout Attila's camp. Of course, nothing impedes a war effort like those two, and it possibly led to the end of the invasion. 3 emissaries, including Pope Leo I, and high civilian officers, Gennadius, Avienus, and Trigetius, were sent by Emperor Valentinian III to meet Attila at Mincio near Mantua and secure his pledge to leave Italy and engage in peace talks with the emperor. In his brief account of the historic meeting, Prosper of Aquitaine attributes all the credit for the successful negotiation to Leo. But Priscus claims that he hesitated because of superstitious fears of Alaric's fate, since Alaric passed away soon after he sacked Rome in 410. That's a little bit of superstition, of course. And so this leads us to 452, when things in Italy were not doing very well. We're talking about crop failures, devastating famine in the year before as well. Not a good time. The year's harvest was not enhanced as well by Attila's destructive invasion of northern Italy's plains. That certainly didn't help. So taking the city would not really improved Attila's supply situation, and advancing on Rome would have required supplies that were pretty much unavailable in Italy. Thus, it was more advantageous for Attila to reach a peace agreement and withdraw back to his native country. In addition to that, an East Roman army led by another officer, Aetius, who had also taken part in the Council of Chalcedon in the year before, had crossed the Danube and defeated the Huns that Attila had abandoned to defend their homeland. Thus, Attila had to retire from Italy without ever setting south of the Po due to strong human and natural pressures. Emperor Marcian, who succeeded Theodosius II in the Eastern Roman Empire, ceased to honor the Huns, while preparing to attack Constantinople, again to recover tribute. Attila retreated from Italy to his palace on the other side of the Danube. But unfortunately, well, not unfortunately for the Romans, but unfortunately for Attila, he died, which is just about the worst possible thing that could happen in the first few months of 453. According to the traditional version of Priscus, Attila was present at a feast commemorating his most recent marriage, this time to the stunning young Ildico, whose name suggests either Gothic or Ostrogothic ancestry. However, he died from severe bleeding while the festivities were going on. He might have choked to death in a daze, or after suffering a nosebleed, or he might have died from an internal hemorrhage, which could have been brought on by an esophageal varices that burst. Now, esophageal varices, which are dilated veins that develop in the lower portion of the esophagus, and are frequently brought on by years of binge drinking, are very delicate and can easily burst, which can result in hemorrhage-related deaths. Marcellinus Comes, a Roman chronicler, was actually the first to write about his death decades after the events, and he states that Attila, king of the Huns and ravager of the provinces of Europe, was pierced by the hand and blade of his wife. But we don't really know if that is true. Either way, we have a full account, as I did promise at the start of the video, from Jordanes before we finish up. And it goes like this. On the following day, when a great part of the morning was spent, the royal attendants suspected some ill, and after a great uproar, broke in the doors. There they found the death of Attila, accomplished by an effusion of blood without any wound, and the girl with downcast face weeping beneath her veil. Then, as is the custom of that race, they plucked out the hair of their heads and made their faces hideous with deep wounds, that the renowned warrior might be mourned not by effeminate wailings and tears, but by the blood of men. Moreover, a wondrous thing took place in connection with Attila's death, for in a dream some god stood at the side of Marcian, the emperor of the East, while he was disquieted about his fierce foe, and showed him the bow of Attila broken in that same night, as if to intimate that the race of the Huns owed much to that weapon. This account, the historian Priscus says he accepts upon truthful evidence, for so terrible was Attila thought to be the great empires that the god announced his death to the rulers as a special boon. His body was placed in the midst of a plain, and lay in a state in a silken tent as a sight for men's admiration. The best horsemen of the entire tribe of the Huns rode around in circles after the manner of a circus game, in the place to which he had been brought, and told of his deeds in a funeral dirge in the following manner. The chief of the Huns, King Attila, born of his sire Mundiuk, lord of the bravest tribes, sole possessor of the Scythian and German realms, powers unknown before, captured cities and terrible, both empires of the Roman world, and appeased by their prayers, took annual tribute to save the rest from plunder. And when he accomplished all this by the favor of fortune, he fell, not by a wound of the foe, nor by treachery of friends, but in the midst of his nation at peace, happy in his joy, and without sense of pain. Who can rate this as death, when none believes it calls for vengeance? When they had mourned him with such lamentations, a strava, as they call it, was celebrated over his tomb with great revelling. They gave way in turn to the extremes of feeling, and displayed funereal grief alternating with joy. Then in the secrecy of night they buried his body in the earth. They bound his coffins, the first with gold, the second with silver, and the third with the strength of iron, showing by such means that these three things suited his mightiest of kings. Iron, because he subdued the nations; gold and silver, because he received the honors of both empires. They also added the arms of foemen won in the fight, trappings of rare worth, sparkling with various gems and ornaments of all sorts, whereby princely state is maintained, and that so great riches might be kept from human curiosity, they slew those appointed to the work, a dreadful pay for their labor. And thus, sudden death was the lot of those who buried him, as well as of him who was buried. And once again, we reach the end of our video for today. Where will we be tomorrow? It's not yet been decided, but it will be another place, another time. But you'll still find me right here on YouTube. I would like to finally thank the top-tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stock Factory, Shell, and Wendy. Thank you very much. And I hope you enjoyed learning about Attila the Hun. And if you feel like returning tomorrow, we'll do it all again. But for now, as I always say, good night, and lots of love to you all.